Welcome to Defy These Times, a podcast dedicated to the easy task of tackling the 21st century. It is a project born out of my conviction that doing so requires an interdisciplinary and intersectional approach to understanding our complex world. I'm your host, Jure Ayoub, and in these episodes I bring you conversations at the intersection of politics, history, philosophy, culture, science, and all the fun stuff in between. The following episode was first published for monthly Patreon supporters. To become a monthly Patreon supporter, please head out to patreon.com/firethesetimes. Or check the website for other methods. You can become a supporter for as little as $1 a month. And if you cannot donate, you can still support this project by sharing with your friends and family and leaving a review on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. The music of this podcast is by Tarabeat. Here's the episode. So this is a conversation with Banah Ghadbian. She's a Syrian activist whose dissertation, Ululating from the Underground, Syrian Women's Protests, Performances and Pedagogies under Siege, was the subject of our conversation. As usual though, we ended up talking about a lot of other things as well. Here's a partial list. You can find a full list in the description of this episode. So we discussed Banah's story, growing up in a Syrian revolutionary family and being targeted by the regime as a result, including from a young age. We tried to answer, the two questions that she asks in her dissertation, which are, how do Syrian women and youth heal from violence? How can our communities be embodied when displaced from our lands and spirits? We try to undo the binaries that usually separate the diaspora from the local. We elaborated on the concept of the multiplicities and the entrenched manliness of war analysis, and here I would reference the episode with Aida Hozic that I did a few weeks ago. We discussed her friendship with Hala Barakat, who was murdered in September of 2017 alongside her mother Uruba, and we talked about her exploration of Pedagogies of Liberation versus what she calls the refugee NGO industrial complex, among other topics. As I said, this is only a partial list. So that's it for me, folks. As usual, I'd love to hear from you, so if you have any thoughts, comments, and feedback, please feel free to contact me. You can find the email on the website. Thanks for listening and take care.
So my name is Banah. I am from Syria. I was mostly raised in the US South and had spent, time throughout the Middle East living, and I have a PhD in ethnic studies. I'm a poet. I have a poetry book coming out next year called Syrian in Space, and that's pretty much what I do.
Awesome. Remember to mention the book towards the end. It will be nice. So
yeah.
Let's start with some background. I mean, you mentioned already a bit. I think it's fair to say, and based on the dissertation that I read, I didn't read all of it. I read parts of it. But it's a deeply personal research, I think it's fair to say. So can you tell us a bit about it?
Yeah, so before the revolution, I never met other Syrians like me or like my family. And I feel like the revolution just opened up this entire universe of other exiled dissident families who I had no idea existed, and other families who had experienced, the imprisonment, the torture, the fleeing. And most Syrians who I had come in contact with, had easy access to Syria. My relationship to Syria is like a lot of Palestinians' relationship to Palestine. I was banned before I was even born. And in that way, it gives me this kind of outsider position that I've always been in. And at the same time, I don't know, it's very political. Like my dad and mom met because they were part of this dissident coalition of activists in the late 1980s who, in a strange historical turn of events, met in asylum in a certain Arab country that I don't know if I should say. And they met because they were backdoor neighbors raising chickens, and both of their families had come to join this revolutionary struggle. And my dad's side of the family are fallah, or farm working Syrians, and I had never met other fallah Syrians. I always met city Syrians. My mom's side of the family are city. they were also working class, but they came from a historically middle class Damascene family, which is like a big deal, you know, their name. So I don't think they would have met each other. Even the way Syria works in terms of class, they were living two completely different realities. And I think that's sort of the problem, was that I've met so many Syrians who were living different realities from me. When I would describe the Syria that my dad and my mom's family had experienced, but particularly my dad's rural farm working experience of like the forced bath modernization projects that devastated their farmlands, you know, the terror of having like all the young people in the town rounded up and like taken to prison all at the same time, the daily forms of abuse. That wouldn't be the Syria that other people in diaspora I would meet would know. They would be like, oh, well, Syria for me is my summer villa in Damascus and my grandpa's in the mukhabarat, but not the bad kind or whatever. So I just felt like I was in this alternate reality. And when the revolution began, I was 16 years old, and I mostly grew up in the US. We lived in Abu Dhabi for a short time. We would visit family in Jordan. We were the only ones, at least growing up, who had the US like citizenship privilege. So I also had these experiences of like going back to the Middle East. And at the time, no one said that they were refugees, so they couldn't actually get asylum anywhere. A lot of my family members to this day don't have any kind of citizenship and were just undocumented, and just kind of experiencing the things that they would go through, you know, like being undocumented Syrians, passportless, floating through these borders, living in Yemen, Iraq, Jordan, today, Turkey. And a lot of, yeah, so anyway, my family changed our names to these fake Armenian names. Uh, my mom had to live under fake names for a long time because they thought the regime would come and track us down for like the work that her family and my dad's family later were a part of. And that ended up happening when I was 16. They did track me down, which is, it's sort of unusual. It's a normal Syrian story in that everyone is wanted somehow by the regime, but it's a little bit unusual in that they would cross state borders. So when the revolution started, I basically released this YouTube video talking about my family's story, that they had to flee in the 1970s and 1980s, that they were forced to give up the one thing they loved the most, which is their homes, their homeland. And so many of them were tortured. And I had so many family members growing up who I knew it was like kind of PTSD, but I didn't know what exactly happened. And it wasn't until the revolution started that they even told me, you know, so and so had been tortured. We had like 10 different people tortured, and some are still disappeared today. Um, so I did this little video, I put it on YouTube at the beginning of the revolution, and the Syrian regime played it on TV. My aunt in Abu Dhabi got a call from her neighbor, who they were also neighbors in Syria, and she was like, go look at Ad-Dunya, that stupid propaganda channel. And my face was playing, and it was like this brainwashed, Americanized, Zionist terrorist child is calling for, you know, overthrow, whatever. So later that summer, 2011, my mom, who's like this amazing activist, she was just like, this is the moment we've been waiting for 40 years. So it's time, and we're going to go to the border. She was in touch with a lot of the activists. She was doing things with Syria Prisoners Movement translation, helping people get asylum. She started like a radio network, Flotilla, what crowdfunded $25,000 to hand deliver this like different supplies that were being denied from the first wave of refugees. And while we were on the border, we were tracked down by the mukhabarat, and they wanted the video girl, who was me, but they also wanted me because I was my father's daughter and my mom's daughter, and it was like, this is an easy thing. So we basically narrowly escaped, and had to flee in the middle of the night. We were followed by these, like, we had a little bit of a heads up, which allowed us to leave in time, and we ended up joining other oppositional activities and joining other people who had just fled the Syrian border, and coordinated with compañeras. I don't like to say comrades because it's such an awkward, like, brocialist term, but with compañeras who were the Zapatista term, but they were in Damascus and we were in Istanbul, and we had these concurrent activist gatherings, and I was a kid basically. So I was just sort of watching all of this happen and listening. We interviewed a bunch of people, my uncles were part of these ragtag like citizen journalist networks. And so, yeah, my parents have always taught me. I grew up with a lot of anti-Arab racism. I grew up, the Intifada, the second Intifada was the Iraq War, the occupation of Iraq. Those were huge things. I'd been going to protests with my parents since I was like 6 years old, and also watching the FBI, interrogate my dad all the time and follow him outside of work and all of these things. So my parents both had this strong sense with us that, especially my mom, that you can always speak. She used to have this Audre Lorde bumper sticker that said, your silence will not protect you. So my dad would say things that like I didn't really understand until much later, but he would be like, even when there's a gun to your head or your knees are on the prison floor and someone's about to beat you to death, they have no power over you. You still have your own spirit, your own voice, and that's sacred and that's sovereign. So that's a little bit of background.
So you're telling me that with all of that, and you still managed to do a PhD?
Yeah. No, it's really interesting. Actually, right after that happened and we escaped and then we joined the oppositional, a month later, I went to college. I was my first year of college, and I went to a historically Black college. And there were so many Black feminist elders who encouraged me to start this project. And that's actually how my dissertation started, was in this gender and social movements class that this Black feminist scholar, Mbahati Kuumba, like encouraged me to do. She was like, you have to write about this, about the stuff you were seeing with the revolutionary dynamics. She knew about Palestine. She was really just like, it just all together kind of planted the seeds. And my mom did a lot of that kind of like early documentation work that I really drew on. I feel like I kind of cheated because I can just ask my parents anything and they know so much. They're, yeah, just these wells of knowledge.
No, it's amazing. I mean, the main questions that you ask in the dissertation, I have them written in front of me, so I'll just quote them if that's okay. How do Syrian women and youth heal from violence? How can our communities be embodied when displaced from our lands and spirits? Okay, sorry, end quote. And I know that we won't be able to give these answers really justice in like a single episode, but maybe we can start with the questions themselves. How?
Yeah. Yeah, I really didn't want to like keep intellectualizing our freedom, because our
Mm-hmm.
freedom is a feeling, it's embodied, it's a practice. And I kept all around the world, like during that 10-year period, I would work in Jordan, in San Diego, in Greece, I went to the refugee camps of the Palestinian youth movement. And everywhere I would go, I would see Syrian women doing the same things, which was using arts and creativity, but it came out of the revolution. And what would happen is this humanitarianization, or this divorcing of everything Syrian from the political and revolutionary origins. So I I like I mentioned Embahati Kumba. She has this book called Gender and Social Movements, and she has this concept of gendered resistance that, like, the protest itself is ephemeral. It's, a moment of freedom, but there's so much work and so much activism that goes into that, whether it's sewing or cooking. There's so many gendered labors it takes, I mean, that are devalued, but who are we without the clothes on our back or the food we eat? Like, all of that is a part of the ways that we're healing. And I also just think of creativity, like the Sylvia Wynter, this Caribbean scholar, talks about, like, poetics and creativity are an alternate relationship from capitalism, because you're not creating to produce, but you're creating to create an alternate reality and to express something. So I just saw, like, I don't know, Syrian kids and Syrian women like making home in difficult places, and it being completely political, but never seeing anyone actually center that. It was always hyper intellectualized or really fucking boring for no reason. Sorry, I don't know if I can
Yeah,
cope.
you can.
it would be these like really mundane geopolitical takes and analyses when the work that they were actually doing is so rich and interesting. And I just felt like centering the actual healing and the entire new forms of structures that they were creating, whether it was freedom schools or alternate medical care or communal forms of care, which now, as we see during different moments of collapse of capitalism during pandemic, how useful these kinds of practices are.
And like definitely along these same lines as what you were just talking about. Can you tell us a bit or a bit more, like what you think is often missing from a lot of discourses regarding Syria?
Yeah, well, the number one thing I would say three things. Well, the first general thing, I always show people this this statistic of, the regime and the Russian allies have been responsible for 91.4% of all casualties, and yet the entire world's focus has been this like war on terror obsession with ISIS. While that's still really important and ISIS is so fucking crazy like horrific and violent, and that should be a focus, I think what's happened is there's just been this intentional obscuring of the roots of the revolution. And I have this whole moment, in the dissertation where I look at like it becomes like a video game. Like it becomes this fun leftist bro-y, they get to talk about Syria being, striked, penetrated, pounded. They use these very gendered, militarized colonial terms. And it becomes intentional that, it's this place of chaos that only a Western researcher can venture into and return and tell the truth about. But yeah, it's just a very simple, I always say like Syria becomes so complicated, but it's a very simple, it's about oppression, it's about systems of oppression, it's about capitalism. That's pretty much what it all is. So, and then the main things I always tell people is that one, Syrians occupy multiple critiques at once. Like we're critiquing authoritarianism, but we're also critiquing the superstructures like colonialism, imperial. A lot of the Syrian activists, like in Daraya, for example, began their activist careers protesting the US occupation of Iraq. Or even in my own family, the way that they became politicized against the regime was because they were politicized because of Palestine and they were fighting the colonizer. And then that allows a certain level of awareness of challenging oppression wherever it is. And then Syrian women and queer people and queer femmes are critiquing patriarchy uh, and homophobia and transphobia all throughout, like so that's why I think some of the critiques coming out of Syria are so interesting, because it's a revolution within a revolution within a revolution. And we look at what Syrian femmes are having to say about all of that, they have some really radical things. And then the other things I always point out, like I just said, is that women's like taken for granted labor is the backbone of our revolutionary struggle. And the last thing is, which I think is the heart and soul of this entire revolution, is children. Like Syrian uprisings started because, like in Lord of the Rings, where Galadriel is like, and the resistance has started in the most unlikely of places. And it's from the hobbits, it's from the Shire. Like, it's from the little people, the people no one gives a fuck about. Like, it's the kids. And kids are so brilliant because they can immediately cut through all the bullshit, and they can name the kinds of worlds that they want. And that simple act of just making graffiti on the walls of their school, in doing that, the children of Dera created an entire new possibility. And no one thought that Dera would be the place. They were like, it's a loyalist region, because they were only considering what the adults were thinking. And now we have 13.5 million refugees, and half of them are children. So you think of all of the sort of revolutionary consciousness and the creative life force that is coming out of Syria. I think it starts and ends with the children.
Well, first, I really appreciate the Lord of the Rings reference.
Yeah.
Just because you mentioned Daraya before, Dara, I will just say that for those listening, that there is a free PDF now available that I worked on the Chronicles of Anna Baladi 2 years ago. And Anna Baladi obviously was founded in Daraya, and it includes a prologue by myself on called an idea called Daraya. All of this is free online. I'll put this in the description. Okay, there are multiple. You mentioned the example of the children of Dara, and that's already something that I feel many people don't know. One thing that recently, while you were talking, I was thinking about it. Like one thing that recently really frustrated me is obviously the commemoration of the 10 years was recently and technically still ongoing. A lot of the coverage, or like overwhelming majority of the coverage, in English or in Arabic, were commemorating the Syrian crisis, the Syrian conflict, the Syrian war, the situation, the Syrian situation, all of these terms, but no one was, I mean, some, but most people were not commemorating the Syrian revolution, even though they were using the date that Syrians have been using for the past decade now of the events in Daraa. And my take on that, which was just a stupid tweet, but it was just 10 years ago was not the start of the crisis, was not the start of the conflict, it was the start of the revolution. Everything
Exactly.
else came later.
Mhm.
But that initial erasure is, for me and for you, obviously, like the entire story here. It's that those are the entire thing. I really view your dissertation, and I don't know, I hope it gets published. I don't know what your plans are, you let me know. Um, as a huge contribution, to be honest, in towards that as well. There were some books that came out in the past few years that have been translated into English. Some have been written in English, some have been written in Arabic, some in French as well. But 10 years on, we're still dealing, Syrians especially, I'm not Syrian, but Syrians especially have been dealing with denying the story itself. Like the actual story of the basic timeline of what the facts of what they're happening, that's still happening. Just before we were talking, I won't name the person because I don't like citing these people, but another one of the many American personalities who deny everything that happens in the region went again, repeated again the claim that for him the white helmets equals Al Qaeda, which many people. I mean, it's not. I don't know if it's a majority. That doesn't really matter, but it's hegemonic. They have taken a stronghold essentially in these discourses, and the divorce between reality and what ended up becoming Syria online, essentially in these discourses, these bros as you described them as well, that would have like a bio on Twitter of like their interests includes video games, Syria, finances, Bitcoin, just like one thing among others. Though I mean it's a caricature, but they exist, lots of them exist. How do you go about, if that's not too, I don't know, if that's not too forward, like, feel free to answer but how do you go about kind of thinking about that, like just dealing with it on an emotional level more than anything, other than just responding to them and yelling at them, whatever, which often doesn't work, but just thinking about it.
Ugh, I it's I mean, from the very beginning, the regime, they're just, well, first of all, they're racist. I like to point that out. It doesn't really matter to them the fact that they can't distinguish between actual terrorists and Arabs who are, or Swana people who are rescuing babies from rubble. Like, what? I don't, it's too much. I've gotten over the years in so many fights, even around the time of March 15th, March 18th. I got in a lot of online fights. Watan Palestine had posted this thing in honor of the Syrian revolution, and it was beautiful, and it was like an international controversy. But I remember getting in fights after the first August 2013 was the first major chemical weapons attack in Eastern Ghouta, and I had like this family member who was whose son was 5 years old, and he got leukemia simply from, he didn't even live, he lived near Douma but wasn't in Douma, and the level of radiation and radioactivity impacted thousands of kids, and they to this day are dealing with the health impacts of that. And writing that and having a freaking leftist bro tell me that it's not real, and that it's that he could have gotten leukemia any other way, but that this was using the regime's exact narrative. And it's it's gaslighting. It's like Yasser Munif says in this really good collection I like, it's called Stolen from the Rubble, Stories of Resistance from Syria by a Mexican anarchist collective, El Robozo. But he has this section where he talks about it's a battleground. Discourse is not just discourse for Syria, it's a literal battleground. It's another war. Like, And I think the way, or in Syria Speaks, they talk about, the usage of the term conflict, of the term crisis. It just, like the term Israeli-Palestinian conflict, like is used to just obscure the actual power imbalances and to imply parity, that there are two sides equally fighting something that's just not true. And the way that I deal with it now is to talk about the creative grassroots activism, because I think centering that actually does speak for itself. When you talk about like the women in Jannah, a group called Jannah in Raqqa, a group of women who were, vocal against the Iraq occupation in the early 2000s, and then during the revolution became active, and they created these different programs with the Raqqa Free Youth Assembly to rehabilitate bombed out high schools, and they would weave the revolution flag into baskets and sell it on the streets to raise money to buy like windows and doors. And then when ISIS came, Suad Nofal, famously one of the women in the collective, one of the founding women, would then hold these one-woman protests outside of the ISIS headquarters with the same revolution banners she used before. Like they're resisting in that example alone, like imperialism, authoritarianism, and then later extremism. The women of Mazaya did the same thing, like Ghalia Rihal, who turned her hair salon into a women's political center in Idlib, and now they run 8 different centers. They have a magazine, a clinic, a school, a library, and during COVID, they were making masks and teaching women in local communities how to sew the masks so that they could sell them and create alternative economies. And they were burned down by extremists in 2014 and again in 2015 by Jabhat al-Nusra. And within a matter of hours, they were rebuilding the center. They were recycling the same regime slogans they used against the regime, which are, "We are not a liability, we are an asset, we are here to stay," using the same exact banners to protest all of those things. So I have a whole section where I talk about Robert Fisk and even Ben Norton, and Rania Khalik, and how in September 2019 they went and met with Assad and they took selfies outside of Signaya, where a prison where from 2011 to 2016 Amnesty documented over 13,000 people were mass executed, 13,000 political prisoners, and they were geotagging it and Saydnaya and saying like beautiful views, or taking selfies being like, this is for the haters, framing us not wanting you to normalize genocide as us being haters. Like, it's just bizarre. I don't even have the bandwidth to engage them. I just try to continually remind people of the actual work itself, of the activism that was happening. And I think that in itself speaks, so much.
Yeah, for sure. I would definitely advise against spending too much time at this point on these people. But like your work, as I said, like was definitely a contribution towards that. And you mentioned though, or at least what I was thinking of, and I took some notes. One thing that I learned a lot from Leila Shami, now we're good friends since we met some years ago. The stuff that many people don't see often are really the changes that have been already, or are the achievements already of the revolution. There is an article that actually came out today, 2 days ago. We're recording this on May 7th, for the record. It's published by Dr. Charlotte Al-Khalili on the Jumhuriyya, and it's called Rethinking the Concept of Revolution Through the Syrian Experience. And everything that we're talking about, listeners, I'll put this in the description. And what she goes through after, and here I'm just reading the blurb, like she finds that while the Syrian revolution may not, in between parentheses, yet have produced political regime change, it has nonetheless brought about profound and likely permanent social transformations. And this is based on years of her own fieldwork with displaced Syrians. And this is something that one of the things that led me to then do the Anabality project and to just think about this from that angle was also part of actually challenging my own perception of how to think about Syria. So like I would definitely say that in the early days, so 2012, 13, 14, and because I'm Lebanese, there was the Hezbollah angle of when Hezbollah intervened in Syria around 2012, but they announced it in 2013. Was really following military developments for the most part. Was really following like who controls which territory where, and you have all of these people online with these insanely advanced maps and all of that stuff. And I'm not saying there's no value in that, like zero value in that, but it definitely overwhelmed everything else. And obviously, who gets erased? That is pretty much everyone else, because most people obviously did not take arms. It's just a fact that in any context, most people will not take arms. And even I'm saying like arms, I'm not problematizing that in itself. Like that's just a different discussion. But like the example of Dara here, especially for me, was something that I was baffled, to be honest. The underground library, the schools, the just the sort of stuff that were happening that felt like I felt bad that I did not have this kind of outlook on life. I was too cynical for these people in my mind. And when I ended up interviewing some of them for the work, again, it's not that I'm then going to the other extreme and romanticizing them. Like many people were just doing things because they had to. It's just something that they had to figure things out. They had to figure shit out as it was happening. It wasn't. Um, I was gonna say something boring, like it wasn't the easiest situation, but I'll just say like, but it was just a very very difficult context, and it still is a very difficult context. And the fact that they happen nonetheless, for me, that tells something pretty profound about just the moment itself in 2011 and since 2011, that goes just beyond the map coloring and who controls which area and when and where and all of that, as if like when ISIS controlled Raqqa, that no one was living in Raqqa other than ISIS. And as you mentioned, the women's group and just everyone else, it's, yeah, sorry, I'm rambling a bit, but it's just one of those things that when I started getting into it a bit more, just that different angle a bit more, changed everything. Like everything else became part of the story, and something sometimes you have to pay attention just for basic safety, if you're in Syria, but it's not the whole story.
Yeah. Yeah, that made me think of so much. Like, that's the thing with the creativity, is it's like Audre Lorde says, and poetry is not a luxury. It's not actually this extraneous thing, but a way that people use to survive their everyday lives. They're creative because they have to be, but also they're improvising, producing collectively, transforming themselves, feeling freedom in their bodies. Like Khutuwat, this organization that was using bed sheets while under siege to make costumes and put on plays with the kids in the shelters. Because you think about it, there's no school, the kids are crowded in a shelter, so you're actually using arts in that context because your imagination is all you have left. And I think of this, there's this group, the Indigenous Action Network. They have this manifesto about apocalypse they just came out with a little while ago, I think when the pandemic started. But they just talk about how like we have all these fantasies of apocalypse, but we don't actually realize that we live, living in a world built on genocide, built on enslavement of West African people, built on a capitalist system, is a form of apocalypse already. And you see in Syria, bio warfare, chemical weapons, barrel bombs, empty barrel bombs filled with TNT, oil barrels filled with TNT. Like none of that is sustainable, and it is a form of actual apocalypse. So that's why I really think it's so funny that people use this language, like we have to empower refugees or teach refugees whatever, when everyone I've met who's been displaced actually has the skill sets and knowledge that the dominant groups might want to learn from and listen, so that they can survive the end of the world. And Syrians have shown us how, like using the body itself as a form of resistance, like the group, like women now, for example, holding actual protests while under in Eastern Ghouta from the bomb shelters. So that's why I have this title, like Ululating from the Underground, because I argue they're using these spaces like Fred Moten calls the undercommons, the sites of Syrian oppression. The reason why I didn't grow up with, you know, I grew up with people kind of normalizing Syria, or Syria in general was considered this peaceful place, but I knew that that was never my family's experience. For them, Syria was terror and brutality. But the reason why Rania Khalek and Ben Norton can go to Damascus today, or look at Sednaya and see and say, oh, this is a beautiful view, is because the sites of Syrian oppression are literally underground. They're in prisons. That's where a lot of the brutality is happening. They're in bomb shelters. That's why people are taking these everyday sites like the hair salon, or these mobile libraries, the underground library in Dareya, for example. And from those places, literally in the underground, they're the most vulnerable people, the ones who were the most marginalized by the militarization, which are the disabled, the elderly, women and children. They're holding protests to this day and having these overtly political messages. Like I talk about like the girls with the green ribbons in my hometown of Tel. They were using olive branches and fake wedding invitations and wrapping these wedding invitations with the olive branches, but secretly having those list the protest site where the next protest would be. And under the eyes of the police, because it was such a feminized everyday item, like a wedding invitation, no one is going to think that's a revolutionary thing. They were reappropriating, those feminized sites as a place of subversion and creativity. They were taking the post office, going to the post office and writing the names of the martyrs and political prisoners on the walls. Like, new forms of protests are emerging from Syria. Even the concept of the flying protest, the 10-minute protest, the street theater, freedom days, whenever they had fake money that were fake Syrian pounds, they would throw like thousands of fake Syrian pounds to the ground and everyone would rush to get them. And the police wouldn't think, oh, this is a protest, but on the money would be banned messages. Or like in the video that I had made from the dissertation, the Stop the Killing movement famously did so many amazing things like that, like passing out flowers with banned messages. But a police officer is not going to see that because he doesn't see a megaphone and someone shouting, and he doesn't know that that's a protest. So engineering new forms of protest, like, there are just, so many things I have to say. And I think like you see this with other communities too. Like Robin D.G. Kelly looked at in the 1970s how Black youth were surviving forms of genocide and racial apartheid and using play and pleasure and music as a way to resist and embody that. And so today, in like Armena's area, because of COVID, these children in this camp, Zumar camp, they're meeting under olive trees and they're creating their own forms of freedom schools. So I think even the way that they're going back to earth, I see so many projects just unwatched on YouTube that have like 10 views of like an old Syrian man, like, making a rooftop garden. Or a lot of Syrians learned how to make solar power, because they were being forced to, because of the electricity blackouts. They were teaching themselves these sustainable, earth affirming, even weaving olive branches, roses and water bottles, that whole thing, like in Banyas with the roses and water bottles, or at the women's marches with the olives, reminding us of earth, weaving our plants like into our forms of protest. It's so genius to me. I just think Syrians are really hard on ourselves. I was in this like clubhouse group or whatever where people were reflecting on the revolution, and there's so many people that are just like, we failed, everything went to shit. It's what I have this whole thing I call the Make Syria Great Again Syrians, where they're like, oh, the revolution destroyed Syria. And I'm like, what about the person who dropped the chemical weapons? Did they not destroy Syria? Everyone was blaming Haram, those sweet children in Der'a. Like, Al Jazeera has this documentary. It's actually really good, but the title is The Boy Who Started the Syrian Civil War. And I'm like, he's not the one who started it. He's not the one bombing people. He was the one who was cultivating the future. He was the one who was creating an alternate reality where all these silences were broken. And I think we should give ourselves credit. And I think we should acknowledge like this is the largest displacement crisis in the world. We're
Mhm.
teaching other people. No one should have to teach Syrian refugees anything. Syrian refugees are teaching the world how to survive. And soon this will start to be something that, more and more with pandemic and all the things that we're going through, like we can learn from what was going on in Syria.
I agree, and I really think that the early signs of what was to come in Europe, and I've mentioned this a number of times on this podcast as well. I mean, people who were following Syria, obviously Syrians included, a lot of those signs were already there. A lot of the Islamophobia that would be thrown at Syrian refugees once they actually reach Fortress Europe were already being thrown at pretty much any Syrian who was rebelling against the Assad regime, especially the armed ones, of course, because it's very easy to just see a Syrian man with a beard and a gun, and then that fits the images that were already in the news, or have been in the news, especially since 9/11. And it became very clear. I think it was, if I'm not mistaken, it might have been Rabin Yassin Kassab that mentions how long before the Syrians were being demonized in Europe, they were being demonized in Syria. And while you were talking, I opened up, I wanted to make sure of the link, but I'll link all of this in the description. There is, I mean, they're no longer active, I think, but there was a Syrian cultural or art group, whatever, called The Syrian People Know Their Way. And they have incredible posters and just like cartoons and whatever. And I've used some of them in like the featured images in the podcast. They have one, I'm just scrolling basically, and there's one where it was when Muhammad Morsi was still ruling Egypt, and they have a photo of him and Mahmoud Ahmadinejad when Morsi went to Iran, and the title is Ikhwan Alamin, like brothers. It doesn't get translated. I don't know how to translate that, but like obviously Muslim Brotherhood. That's the reference. But like, who are you brothers with? I guess I don't know. Yeah, whatever, something like along those lines. And they just have these these nuanced critiques on so many different levels. They would compare like Israel with Hezbollah, which many people obviously don't want to do. They would openly condemn the Bahraini the crushing of the Bahraini revolution by the Saudis and the Bahraini governments. They would say stuff like to Nasrallah as if they're talking to him, and they're basically all over the place in ways that to this day, with the exception of some revolutionaries across the region that I can name and usually know by name, so there aren't that many of them, I haven't really seen, and as a Lebanese, I can definitely say that in Lebanon I haven't seen it as much. This sort of conscious, I mean, I guess we can call this conscious intersectionality without the term. So without even using any kind of academic terms, just literally just doing it.
Mhm.
And that's something that I mean, listeners who speak Arabic will get to see the nuances on the posters, but I think maybe everyone else can as well. It's just, yeah, I'm talking, I'm talking to you as if you can see the screens, but whatever. And they even did posters in Spanish, posters in Russian, posted obviously in Arabic, in Farsi. They went all over the place, and it's a fascinating group that I'm sure someone has studied more extensively than I have. But yeah, I just wanted to put that out there, and I will link this in the description as well.
Well, one of the groups that's still active is Creative Memory of the Syrian Revolution, and
Yes, that's a good one.
they have a map with over 7,000 archived creative works, from posters to paintings. And I think, like you said, you can click different areas of the map and it's amazing. And you can see the kinds of creative critiques that are embodied in the art itself. So if you click Raqqa, you see, these commentaries on terrorism, like how everyone conflated Raqqa with terrorism. You click a place like Menbej, which Yasser Munif did a whole stay there and wrote a book about it. But they experienced a lot of U.S. airstrikes, and there was an artist, Mustafa Yaqub, who did like political graphic art, about how the casualties were children, mostly children. If you click like Adra, you'll see the kinds of things coming out of Adra prison were mostly images of women and talking about sexual violence. You you click on a Kurdish area like Qamishlo, you're going to see critiques of the regime, of Turkish intervention from a specifically Kurdish lens. It's so amazing. The art is this living memory that keeps all of it alive. And it's these modes of cognition that are unrecognizable to the dominant colonial whatever. I think that's why art tells the truth, is because it's not like a statistic. It's not another thing. It's not another sort of scientific or intellectualized thing, but in like so many Western societies, like, you know, the oral cultures are seen as coming from the non-human void, are seen as like more primitive, more barbaric, and we're actually reappropriating these kinds of forms itself to name the world and to like keep a record of everything. Because you can deny the chemical weapons attack all you want, but you look at like a Syrian woman artist like Renda Marrar, who made these strange, disturbing images after the chemical weapons attack, you know, of children, and they're sort of ghostly and just, it's so disturbing, and you can't deny it when you see that kind of work. Yeah, it's so interesting.
It is, and kind of like sort of a segue. It just makes me think of this concept that I've since been thinking a lot about since talking to Ida Hozic on this podcast. So that's episode 69 for those listening. So she's from Sarajevo originally, and she wrote a pretty good article, pretty good essay for LSE, like a blog post, a long blog post on what she called the entrenched manliness, quote unquote manliness, of ethnic power sharing agreements. And obviously, as a Lebanese, we had so many points of comparisons of things to talk about. Obviously, the Ta'if agreement happened a few years before the Dayton agreement. For those listening, Ta'if is the one that ended the Lebanese war, and Dayton, the one that ended the Bosnian war, ended in quotation. And we ended up talking a lot about how there are multiple Bosnias, and there are actually multiple Daytons, like multiple Dayton Accords. And I'll sort of develop this idea a bit and then ask you a question. The multiple Dayton Accords, and I won't repeat it too much because there's an entire episode about it anyway, but in the sense that there's these accords of the ones that negotiated it. So the diplomats, the Western diplomats, the Bosnian diplomats, and the Serbian Croats that were observers. But there's also the Dayton of the people who had to endure it. So you had the ordinary Bosnians, essentially, regardless of which ethnic background they belonged to, they now had to deal with a new reality of now being defined specifically through that lens. And you started seeing things like prior to the wars and the genocides and everything, you had something like 30% of the population being from like multiple marriages, and those kinds of statistics being basically like close to zero right now. And that those sorts of things are not considered failures of the quote unquote peace agreement, because the only criteria for a peace agreement is these guys had guns, now they're not shooting at one another. That's the only criteria. And in Lebanon, that was the only criteria as well. In Lebanon, the Ta'if agreement was basically imposed by Hafiz al-Assad. Long story there, I've ranted about it elsewhere, it's not that important here. But long story short, the same men that caused the war, or at least that were its primary actors, let's put it that way, just continued in power. And that's for me one of the many reasons why in my own research I argue against a war post-war binary, because I don't think that's really accurate. So the notion of multiple or multiplicities, right? Multiple Syrias, we even started getting into it a bit more with her. But I was wondering if you can sort of talk about that, and like what you think about that. Let's put it that way. And yeah, let's start with that, because I have a follow-up question on that.
Yeah. It's like I said earlier, like I was the product of a Syria that so many other people I knew never saw or never lived, or even with my own family. Coming from a farm working experience in the Syrian context, I very rarely hear any representations of that in Syrian literature, or I mean, unless it's like to romanticize it, or to sort of like on WhatsApp or something, make it seem like this primitive pre pre-modern thing when like people are still living like that today in Syria, and they're complicated, and they're not like, I don't know, some museum exhibit of like, authentic Bedouin Arab, whatever. Apparently, someone told me this recently. When people go on birthright to Israel, the first thing they show them is like an authentic Fallah Palestinian Bedouin, setup. So that's really interesting because, okay, like I have this whole theory that a big pillar of like these regimes all across our region operated on this kind of idea of like modernization and Arab identity becoming the only identity, and sort of what neoliberal multiculturalism did in the US in the 90s, which is say that we're all one big melting pot and kind of deny the specific ethnic and class and sect and religious realities that other people were experiencing, to all kind of normalize the different ways that everyone was experiencing authoritarianism according to their own context. And I just feel like with Syria, specificity is so important. I mean, like, even my mom, like at the beginning of the revolution, did these, I don't know if you know Jane Elliott's Brown Eyes, Blue Eyes, where to teach white people about racism, she would treat a certain group in the classroom
Yeah.
to see if they noticed. So my mom would do that around like Sunni Arab privilege. And she would have people come into the workshop, and some people had to wear an orange ribbon around their hand, similar to how Kurdish people have to list their ethnicity on their papers. Certain people were not allowed to leave the classroom. Some people were given other resources. And I think when we talk about this sort of triangulation that happened in Syria, like a lot of peacekeepers compare the Syrian situation to Rwanda or Burundi. It is actually rooted quite literally in the colonial mandate. Like all of these divisions that the regime supposedly was resisting against, it replicated it in a different way. But if the 1922, the French didn't literally divide us into the Alawite coastal region, the Druze mountain area, and then the Greater Arab, Sunni, whatever, I think there's this huge problem where like we have these ideas that in the post-war period, like we're going to end up in the same kind of regime if we just allow like the dominant people to, I mean, the way that we got here to begin with is we had a military hero who took power and said that he was against the old system but really replicated it. And I saw that with the revolution, where there was this danger again of history repeating itself, and the men coming to the front and like replicating everything that we'd been working so hard to dismantle. I don't know if that kind of answers. I'm also rambling a little bit.
No, it does. And I mean, it's one of those questions that I don't know, it feels more like an open-ended question, to be honest. I do find it very, very useful to think about multiplicities. And I've started sort of like slowly expanding on like just think about other stuff, not even related necessarily to the region or to Lebanon or Syria or whatever, but just in general having multiple experiences at once, or like multiplicities. I guess I'm just repeating myself a bit. And another dimension of that is the often simplistic binaries between diaspora and local, right? Of like, if you're diaspora, you have you do have different experiences. That's part of the story, of course. But as if a lot of, I'll just use a kind of an example that has happened many times, but I'm just telling it in this kind of caricature way. But like, you'll have pro-regime Syrians in Damascus ranting against Syrian refugees in Europe or America or whatever, first generation, second generation migrants, whatever, like multiple experiences of that diaspora, whether new diaspora, older diaspora, I should say, with the whole, well, we know what it's like and you don't know what it's like because we are in Syria and you're not. And that's one of the multiple ways, that's just one of the many, many ways in which the whole narrative of authenticity can be just weaponized for the wrong reasons. And it's why I personally, I don't necessarily ask listeners to subscribe to this, but personally it's why I usually shy away from narratives of authenticity. I try as much as I can to, when I'm offering critiques of Zionism, to not just say, well, I'm the grandson of a Palestinian, fuck you, because usually that doesn't lead anywhere. I mean, that's been my experience. I actually try and dismantle it from within. Like I try and provide coherent, well, it's very difficult, but I try and provide coherent narratives. And one way that I've been trying to do it is to actually appeal to Jewish history rather than to Arab history. And just because then there is some common ground, and that's how I felt that I've managed to at least provoke some change or some doubts, let's say, in some people. In the past, I haven't done this in a while, but that's just something I've been thinking about. In Lebanon, I try and have a Lebanon angle as much as I can. I don't want to be too stereotypical and be the Lebanese who always talks about Lebanon, but there is a parallel here is that I was listening. I won't mention names because it wouldn't be fair. But I was listening to a conversation between two Lebanese that one of them I know, the other one I just know, like I know his name, and they were talking a lot about issues in Lebanon. Not once was even the word woman mentioned. So women's rights. Not once was that mentioned. Not once when discussing Hezbollah was Syria mentioned. They vaguely mentioned Hezbollah being a regional army now, so there was kind of that implied, but nothing concrete. And everything was then framed in a, let's call it, Lebanese liberal maybe framework. So it had its downside; those are two obvious ones. But it had its, I don't know if I would call them upside, but let's say point in which um, I can anchor myself in and then have the conversation that I want to have. So if they are ignoring the kafala system, I would say, well, you want this to be achieved, okay, but this is why it cannot be achieved if we do not tackle the kafala system, to kind of use that as an example. So what I'm trying to get at is I'm trying to learn a lot from what you yourself call like pedagogies of liberation. And of course, there's an entire history of this. There's liberation theology in Latin America. There's just so many different things that I'm not necessarily most qualified to talk about. But I'm wondering if you can yourself like explain like to you what does pedagogies of liberation mean, and how could these pedagogies be an alternative to what you yourself called the refugee NGO industrial complex?
Well, I want to just mention something about diaspora because I really like how you brought that up. Like, um, I think now since half of Syria is displaced, we inevitably are finally having conversations about diaspora and that there's no such thing as authenticity, and that people often positing themselves as authentic are usually the most patriarchal. First of all, and I remember at the beginning being a teenager, and I was with my friend Hala Barakat, who would later be murdered, and she would
I
always people would always
I didn't know that you knew her. I'm sorry.
yeah, she was my first Syrian revolution sister. She was a big part of, maybe I'll talk about this later, but a big part of who I am. And but people would always tell us, you have no right to speak. You guys are teenage girls. You know nothing. What do you think you know about Syria? And she would always be like, okay, well, we didn't choose to come from exiled families. And would you rather that we say nothing at all, that we remain silent? Like from every position we are, like our speaking doesn't cancel out other people. I think there's this scarcity idea, this capitalist idea that like not all of us, there's an authentic, real Syrian experience, and the diaspora is this watered down thing. And Gayatri Gopinath has this amazing book, Queer Diasporas, where she talks about conventional diasporic discourse is this always a backward glance of nostalgia of, a very heterosexual kind of experience too, of like what it means to be authentically like, what your authentic homeland is. But the queer body, the queer diasporic body, makes all of these desires come alive, and also remembers all of the kinds of violences and the displacements, the multiple displacements. And I think there's something there now, like Syrian, there's this group, Syrian Association for Citizen Dignity. They have this campaign called We Are Syria, and they're basically trying to argue not only to the UN, but to the whole world, that like, if we want any kind of political transition in Syria, we have to consult diaspora too. Like, there is no way that we can have free and fair elections if half of Syria is displaced. You know, there's a new kind of like what it means to even be Syrian. It's much, to me, overlapping obviously as well with Palestinian identity, where it becomes a new thing. It no longer even is confined to a nation state, because like it's embodied, it's in me. I've had this Middle Eastern studies professor during grad school, and he would always, you know, do that to me, where he would be like, well, I went on Fulbright. He went on a regime sponsored Fulbright, you know, so he got access to Syria. And the fact that I didn't have it, or that I am wanted for 50 million lira, somehow means that I'm less Syrian than he is, when in a really funny way that actually makes me more Syrian than any, like, that is the most Syrian thing I know, to be wanted. Like, so I don't know if that makes sense, but I think this does connect with the pedagogies of liberation, because there's this thing that happens in diaspora with humanitarian work, where a lot of the Asad Remadi gray normalizer people will be the same ones who are running the NGO, the refugee NGO. And that's incredibly harmful. Like in San Diego, I moved there for grad school. A year later, 2,000 Syrian displaced Syrians were relocated there. And the only organization they had to support Syrian refugees specifically was called Heart for Refugees. And it was created by Syrian Americans who took a Lichtag Foundation Zionist grant, basically. And they had this program called Angels Bringing Bringing Light to Lives in Darkness. And like very colonial, very paternalistic, and very pro-Assad. And they would say things about the Syrians like they're lazy, they don't work hard enough, whatever. And so for our youth, so I worked with Palestinian Youth Movement, and we decided to like create this entire collective in protest to that group. And we created the only other Syrian youth organization. And eventually now it's called the Majdal Center, but at the time it was called AYC, Arab Youth Collective, which I disagreed with the name. But anyway, but basically within that, so we revolted against the other Syrian diasporas people because of Zionism and this issue of Zionism and them normalizing. But then within our group, other Syrians joined, especially like from Europe and I don't know, and they wouldn't let the kids, like the kids themselves would be like, we want to do a protest for Aleppo. Like some of these kids led revolutionary protests where they're coming from in like Homs, and they're like 17 or 18, and they wanted to protest, and the group was like, oh well, we can't make this political, you know. So I think this whole like NGO complex, like Arundhati Roy says, like they diffuse political anger. A lot of the revolutionaries who are on the ground in Syria now, like Razan Ghazawi, was, I need to credit them for this, because she said this to me recently, like a lot of the people, either they're dead, they're tortured, they're in prison, some of the early Syrian people, or they're working for NGOs. And the NGO has been this funded, friendly way to kill the revolution. And so when you see the pedagogies of liberation, you see Miss Noor al-Huda Hifar opening this school, this freedom school for disabled children called Golden Bridges. And she's using a political, you know, the kids are expressing political messages, or that viral story about the sixth grader, the Kurdish sixth grader in Turkey, Gulstan Mustafa, who started her own like neighborhood school from like cardboard boxes and helped kids during COVID with their homework. Like Syrians are actually don't need those resources. They're using very little resources to envision new forms of social institutions completely outside of capitalism. But you have this NGO complex being depoliticizing the whole thing and making it a humanitarian thing or a psychological thing. Oh, refugees are using art. Where do you think that came from? That came from the protests. That's why it's completely, it's all woven in together. Like you can't divorce it from the political. The same people working in that system often use these concepts of like civility and like citizenship and making refugees good citizens or whatever. It's like the Zapatistas say in the cracks in the wall, like you can't soften up the wall. You can't change it from within because the wall is still there and it's still fucking all of us over.
Uh, I was thinking of a lot of examples as you were talking of parallels as well in Lebanon. But okay, a number of things. You phrased it very well, like the scarcity logic, which is obviously I completely agree, like an inherently capitalistic logic. We see this like Palestinian leftists, Palestinian feminists have to deal with it with Palestinians, often Palestinian men, although some Palestinian women conservatives would say like we can't deal with this now, we can't deal with the feminist stuff now, whatever terms they would like to use. We'll deal with this after liberation. And obviously the critique, or the much needed critique among Palestinian feminists, is that this is part of the revolution, liberation revolution, everything. And in Lebanon, for me, there were lots of flaws, as with any protest movement. The fact that it was largely Lebanon or Lebanese only, with the exception of some Syrians and Palestinians who participated but had to invisibilize themselves in order to participate. There was the feminist march. There were a number of them. There was one big one that I also attended, and one of the things that really struck me is how they were using both. They were appealing to the same chants that were being chanted by the wider population. Killon yani killon, all of those stuff. Shabi يريد إسقاط النظام, all of that stuff. But then changing so one funny one that I always like quoting because it's really funny. It's obviously there's the Hila Hila Ho song about Jabran Basil, and it was, and here I'm gonna swear in Arabic, but it was like Hila 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 Ho Jabran Basil Kasammo. So that was the original one. They changed that to Ayri B'Jabran wa B'Ammo. And so basically, like Ammo being how the fuck that sorry. So the song basically is Jabran Basil, that's who was the foreign minister at the time, son-in-law of the president. Because Emmo basically means fuck him, but it literally means the vagina of his mother, because Arabs are very creative. And then it was changed to how do you translate it? Eyre de Jabran, so fuck Jabran, but Eyre means my penis, and Wabammo and his uncle, father-in-law, whatever, meaning Michel, the president. And so they use the exact same chant, and they have another one. I'll stop at that. It was, what was it? There used to be these roadblocks, and they also changed the Hila Hila Ho song because it just became just a chant because it was very catchy. I forgot it. Fuck, I forgot it. But it was something along the lines of like, people stuck in traffic, come and join us, or something like that. Because obviously they caused the traffic by blocking the road. So just these multiple creative stuff. I wrote an article for Shadow Mag. I'll link it on like a look at the Lebanese chants, essentially the chants being used at the protest, and those are overwhelmingly like feminist dominated spaces.
Mm-hmm.
Overwhelmingly. And that's I had to emphasize this so many times because people because I would give interviews during the uprising, and they would tell me like, oh, you're someone who likes to bring up women's rights and LGBT rights and anti-kafala stuff and whatever, as if the implication was always that I'm just being a nice guy who wants to uplift certain voices, just to kind of like to be nice. Whereas what I always try to get at, and I have failed multiple times to get to that point, because the question would then go back to the initial question, that what I'm actually saying is that this is where the real stuff is happening. Other stuff happening matters. I'm not saying it doesn't matter, but not paying attention to the feminist chants, for example, the feminist marches, just misses all of the story in my view. So anyway, now was my time to ramble about this. Sorry.
Think of at the beginning of the revolution and like some of the coalitionary stuff where because my parents brought us, like I was there at those conferences where they were trying to very first kind of organize the revolution. They had the groups in Damascus, and they had the groups also who had just fled, and some of them even came from Syria to join us in Istanbul. But what ended up happening at those early opposition conferences mirrored and foreshadowed the Syrian revolution, where Kurdish contingents did a walkout because the Arab majority were not centering or understanding the specific Kurdish issues that they were bringing up. the young people, we created this whole other coalitionary body called Cyan, Syrian Youth Activist Network, because the old guard, like a lot of these young guys especially, were the ones starting the revolution, and then they come to these conferences and like these old ammos are like dominating, and there's like old exiles, like this is their time, and they're like, so there was an ageism issue. And I looked around the conference as all of these walkouts and all of these protests were happening within the conference. And I turned to this Syrian woman journalist based in Abu Dhabi, and I was like, in all of this, not one woman has spoken. And she was like, oh, you're so naive. We take care of gender after the revolution. And it was so funny because I was like, well, who, like, it was like the women that I knew and was looking up to, like Maryam Jalebi and others, who planned the conference, who like did all the logistics coordination, who got the funding together, who invited everyone, who booked the entire place. It was women. And they were the ones who were being marginalized. I think that's why like Black feminists like Kimberly Crenshaw had this idea of intersectionality. It's so important that we talk about these things at the same time. It reminds me of in the Undercommons, there's this quote, I just pulled it up, that it's a coalition. It's by Fred Moten. He says that there's a coalition that emerges out of your recognition that it's fucked up for you in the same way that we've already recognized that it's fucked up for us. I don't need your help. I just need you to recognize that this shit is killing you too, however much more softly, you stupid motherfucker. Like he's talking about like white people, how they think, or men, they think they're being nice by like supporting feminism or whatever. But the reality is it won't shift until men start to understand that it's also killing them too. And it's also gender and the gender binary and heteronormativity and all of these things are actually impacting everyone. So centering that at the very center, not just making these separate little like containers where we put the queer issue, we put the Kurdish issue or whatever, but realizing that we can do it all at once, actually. And I think that's why, like I said, Syria is a revolution within a revolution within a revolution. And especially with Syrian queers, I feel like the critiques that they have, or maybe I could transition to talking about some of the work we did this summer around anti-Blackness, like slowly starting to realize like, oh, these are all actually deeply interconnected. Like the regime operates on intense amounts of policing of sexuality. It's an authoritarian, patriarchal, it's the father figure. It's like an abusive father figure for all of us. So feminism is not just for Syrian women, but it's also something for everyone. It's liberating for everyone. And I think like one of the critiques that people had on my committee of my dissertation was like, well, you say this is feminist, but would Syrian women or Syrian activists, would they actually call what they're doing feminist? And I don't really care. Like, I understand feminism has been, used for imperialist means. It's obviously really important to recognize that. But there's like Women Now has a project called Gender Justice and Feminist Knowledge Production. Like people are doing consciously feminist things. And I think they'll continue to do that work too.
Yeah, I should just say for disclosure purposes that I briefly worked with Women Now last year. I mean, on the matter of anti-Blackness, I wanted to ask a question about this in a bit, but I will just briefly say that Mariam Elba wrote an article for The Intercept 4 years ago on why white nationalists love Bashar al-Assad. And this is something that I also, I mean, among other people, have pointed out a number of times. It's just something very obvious. One person that I always mention when I have to, a guy, now I forget his name, Matthew Heimberg. He's a neo-Nazi, essentially an American neo-Nazi, and he loves to post photos of himself with Hezbollah t-shirts. And for me, that's just much more revealing than I don't need anyone to critique anything else. I just need that photo, and that tells me everything I need to know. A number of things that you mentioned, just I was reflecting also while you were talking. Like the whole so James Baldwin has this quote, I don't need your help, I just need you to get out of my way, or something like that. And obviously he was talking to white people. It was, I think, one of the debates he had or whatever. But the idea, and he also developed that multiple times in different ways, not just in the sense of just like leave me alone, which is already a big thing, because obviously black people, black men, particularly in America, aren't left alone. That's the entire thing. I forgot the name of the man who was shot while jogging, you know, as an example. Um, yeah. But he developed that critique even further a number of times, and for him it was always about. So I'm working on this video. It's still in its early phases, but it's about like James Baldwin's most radical idea, in my view, and it's the fact, according to him, that the oppressed don't just know the oppressors more than the oppressors know the oppressed, but the oppressed tend to know the oppressors better than the oppressors know themselves. And this is something that I feel, well, for me anyway, was what really appealed, what really got me into his line of thinking, and then it, you know, went into other stuff. I remember the chant, so I'll just say it. It's طريق مسكر يا حلو. So it's play on words, and it was, instead of saying again hela hela ho, it was basically what they were channeling, the anger that is very common on Lebanese streets during traffic. And this time it was like human caused I mean, it's always human, but you know, it was protesters caused traffic, and they were channeling that chant into, well, the road is closed, oh handsome one, essentially. And so just as another example of that, you talk a lot in your dissertation, at least the bits that I've read, on the tensions between visibility and invisibility, right? And visibilizing and invisibilizing, like as actions, as something that are done. I'll briefly say that I may interview him at some point, but it's not confirmed. I've interviewed him for my PhD, but I mean on the podcast. Ghassan Halwani, a Lebanese director, has this movie called Erased: Ascent of the Invisible, and the entire thing is about his father was one of those forcibly disappeared in Lebanon. Adnan Halwani is his name. And Ghassan, the entire film, it's a really good film. I recommend it. It's a documentary. And he draws images of the people, the men and women who were forcibly disappeared. So he draws them and animates them. And it's an entire thing. The notion of invisibility, visibility is something that I'm also dealing with a lot, looking at post, quote unquote, post for Lebanon, post 1990 Lebanon. But I'm very curious about like your experience of studying that really, and obviously writing about it, and how does it differ. Okay, I'll ask this in two ways, like the tension between visibility and invisibility, and also maybe the tensions between, and you already talked about this a bit, inside Syria and outside Syria.
Yeah. Well, I keep thinking of things the James Baldwin thing. There's Angela Davis has an article where she talks about Black women domestic workers knew not only like they knew whiteness so intimately because they knew the tactics, the relationships, the intimate details of the oppressor, because they have this interior, like intimate day-to-day view of it. And Audre Lorde also had that too. It just reminded me of it so much. But so yeah, like I would always scour headlines for things about Syrian women just to read what was happening. And there would always be this question of like, where are the Syrian women? Where are the Syrian women? And similar to like women's labors being behind that entire revolutionary oppositional organizing, like women's labor was everywhere in the revolution, but I would never see enough about what women were actually doing. And instead it would just assume that women were missing, or it would be hyper visible and it would say, there are villages full of Syrian lesbians to date, an obsession with this Orientalist obsession with their sexuality under war zones. Or the BBC had this horrible, not funny parody called The Real Housewives of ISIS. I think eventually they took it down because they realized it was racist, but it was really bizarre because I had like been talking to women who in the refugee camps in Greece who were telling me about sexual violence by the regime and by ISIS. And then the only coverage I would see is either these kind of like voyeuristic humanitarian reports where they're nameless, Lema Kanut actually has a really good book called So I'm Not Kept in the Shadows, Oral Histories of Syrian Women Survivors of Sexual Violence in Regime Prison. But like in general, I wouldn't hear that in any mainstream. Instead, they would be making fun of them. And to me, that was like a kind of hypervisibility. Even with like with Alan Kurdi, his name was, the Syrian refugee child whose body was found washed up on the shore. Like either he was, you know, circulated as this decontextualized image, or you had like the Charlie Hebdo cartoon where he was depicted as a monkey and a rapist had he grown up. So it's this kind of like cartoon caricature that I kept seeing, where Syrian women were either not there or they were there in an obscenely like misrepresented way, and both of them are a form of violence. And I think because so much of Syrian women's violence that we face is also interior, you know, and invisible, and it's not the same, like it doesn't get the same kinds of coverage. It's so taboo to talk about. It happens in regime prisons. It happens, you know, like Arab in general, Arab Swana, like oppression in the US especially is a form of hypervisibility in times of crisis. Like Joe Cadi says, to be Arab is to be hypervisibilized in times of crisis and invisibilized. um some quote like that, I can't remember, but invisibilized in the everyday. And I have this metaphor of, I look at mermaids like and I look at Syrian women and I say that their bodies are actually represented really similarly, because I would go on YouTube and I would look at these mermaid conspiracy videos, and the comments would say things like, oh, mermaids are, you know, they can go through borders. And so in the Philippines, we put these drones to surveil all these mermaids. Or people would be like, oh, poor thing, you know, she looks so scared. We need to rescue her. Like, she's so helpless, or she's so sexy. I wonder where I can find one. You know, like some YouTube comments would be like, I wonder how you penetrate a mermaid. And I would see this surveil, like this idea. That's where I got this whole idea that like, oh, Syrian sirena subjectivity. Sirena is mermaid in Spanish. Like we cross borders, we're threatening our bodies, especially with the whole discourse around hijab. You know, like, can you penetrate a Syrian woman? Like Syrian women's bodies are spoken about in popular discourse and journalism and legal discourse as these like either things to be feared or these fantasies, and there's no in between. Even with like this Muslim ban, you know, in November 2016, like there was this #1 hashtag around the world that 8 Syrians caught, #8 Syrians caught, and there were 8 Syrian terrorists caught on the US-Mexico border. And like that propelled this whole like, you know, the election, everything that was going on. Like all of these states then declared that they oppose Syrian refugees and blah blah blah. And it turned out to be like a family, and half of them were children. Like they were 4 kids, and like 2 uncles and a mom and dad, and they were just literally trying to cross into the US, and everyone misrecognized their bodies as ISIS. You know, and just in a lot of ways, it's such a gendered process. Syria itself, I argue, becomes a gendered body itself, and Syrians become an extension of that gendered body. That in the Orientalist, you know, thing, it's either we need to know the body. We need to know if you can be a good migrant, if you can be like Steve Jobs, the good Syrian refugee, the white Syrian refugee, or if you're the terrorist, and there's no in between. So we're invisibilized into whiteness, which invisibilizes brown Syrians, black Syrians, non-white Syrians, and then we're also hyper-visibilized as these threats.
So many thoughts. I just so I'll throw them at you, just see what I can remember as well. But the the whole like Steve Jobs or terrorist, basically. I mean, you know, in France there was that story of, I forgot what's his name. They called him Spider-Man, which is shit. But there was this guy. He was an asylum seeker, I think, or a migrant, and you know, he saved the.
Of superhuman capability.
Yes, yeah, like he saved the child, and then he and then he was given the nationality the next day or something, and then the joke became that, well, you have to become a superhero essentially, or the German. I'm trying to get this right, but I think part of the team that discovered the first vaccine was
Oh,
like a Turkish German team or something like that, or they were on it or whatever, and so they were being praised as again the model minority thing, and it's like, uh, how, like, what exactly needs to be done? Like, what are the lists of achievements? Denmark right now, I'm sure you know, is threatening, and it is deporting at least 94 Syrians, and because they're not willing to actually go back to Syria, because why would they? They're going to be basically in these camps, and those are Syrians who, like, one of them is 17 and she's learned Danish and she's about to graduate and whatever, and like the question is always like, what needs to be done in order to quote unquote integrate? And the thing is that that's a false question. Like, the question itself for me is, as we know what the answer is, and that's like pretty much it's impossible. Like, the standards are so impossibly high that it is simply not possible for most people to even have access to this, to become quote unquote the good Syrian or the good Arab or the good African, the good migrant, good what have you. So like that's one thing. The other thing of you mentioned before, the so the Alan Kurdi, when of course when his body was found, I remember Yusuf Nair, who's this Palestinian American academic, I guess. We contributed to the same book, so that's how I know him. The book is called Social Justice and Israel Palestine, I should say. But anyway, so he said after Alan Kurdi was like in the, obviously he had these massive headlines and the failures and all of that, which, like, even in my, sometimes I was trying to be maybe optimistic, maybe naive. I was telling myself, well, maybe this is gonna change things or whatever. But he simply pointed out, like, if, unfortunately, I'll just say it as it is, like, if their children made a difference, Palestine would have been freed a long time ago. And it's just a fact. And it's just one of those things that I don't, let me see if I can express this adequately. Like, there are these multiple narratives and multiple stories happening at the same time, right? And for me, it's not that I wouldn't, I would still see if the, for lack of a better term, the Alan Kurdi moment would change things, because sometimes some freakish random, series of events, it might lead to some kind of policy change or whatever. And so I would kind of put a pin on it and see how that develops. But then obviously in the back of my mind, I have all of these dozens and if not hundreds of cases in which that had not made any difference. And for me, Syria, at least in the past decade now, past decade now, has become this connecting thread in many things. And it's how I've managed to sort of see comparisons between Libya and Syria, Hong Kong and Syria, Bosnia and Syria, Ukraine and Syria. And of course, comparisons are never perfect. You always have more differences than similarities. But you sort of trying anyway to sort of see these connecting threads that have, for the most part, been unexplored, or at least not explored enough. Let's put it that way. There are more. I'm not the only one doing it, obviously. Many people are doing this. It's just not enough, in my view. Yeah, so that also rambling on my part. I wanted to ask a question that is like sensitive and difficult, and it's kind of like, I'll just say it. It's something that, as a Lebanese, again, I'll use that stupid card, but it's very difficult to talk and think about sectarianism. It's just something that it's not an easy thing to talk about, especially when, as anti-sectarians, you're dealing with, for the most part, people who openly appeal to sectarianism. I'm kind of being simplistic, but that tends to happen a lot. And in Lebanon, the question has always been like, then how do you deal with, let's say, zealots? Like, how do you deal with people who are really, who see you in a binary, like you're either with them or against them, and that's it, and nothing could be done. Obviously, in Lebanon, we saw this a lot with Hezbollah in the past year and a half, but not just them. They are just the most powerful group right now. In Syria, I remember when not when he was killed, but like a couple of years after Basil Shahada was killed in Homs, I had shared, well, I've basically been doing it every year on the date of his of his death. This documentary that he had released, like Christmas in Homs, or Merry Christmas Homs, or something like that. I will find the link and put it in the description. And so I would mention a few times that, well, he was Christian, because of the Christmas documentary. And my my intention was not to say, well, look at this Christian standing with the non-Christians, My intention was to just say that there are multiple experiences at the same time. But I've often found, and this is where I don't have an answer to this. It's really like out in the open, that most of the overwhelming majority of my Syrian friends who are obviously anti-Assadists, who have been involved in all of these things, a lot of them come from different backgrounds. Kurdish, Syrian, what have you, Alawi, what have you, um, Shia, Sunni, okay, etc. And they usually wouldn't say that. They won't say it out loud. They would just say we're Syrians, and I can think of course the chants Wahad Wahad Wahad, Shab Suri Wahad. I can think of these things, and I understand the spirit of it, and it's very important. I definitely subscribe to it, on the Lebanese side of things as well. I just don't know how to then, because the regime obviously is using these things. The regime is saying we are protecting Syrians, we are protecting Christians, we are protecting Shias, we are protecting, etc., etc. And so my question, and Druze, etc. So my question to you is like, how do you personally navigate this, whether in your own private life, personal life, with friends, family? I don't know really, but yeah. So how do you navigate this personally and politically as well, if that makes sense? And sorry
It's
for the very long preface to this question.
important. Like, so you're saying, how do you navigate kind of almost the silence around sectarianism? Mm.
Yeah, pretty much. Yeah. And the
Yeah,
fact that it can be a taboo. It can just be very difficult to talk about it.
yeah, it's so real. And it wasn't even until the revolution started that like I said, like I never really met the full range of diversity of Syrians. I knew nothing about. I now have Syrian friends like who are Druze, who are Assyrian, who are Armenian, and I was such in a little bubble before of my own family's specific experience that I never even, I mean, like we talked about multiple Syrias, like even the regionalism, like people didn't know that the Falah experience exists in its own kind of interesting way. And it's very different. Every single one, 30 minutes away from each other, we have completely different words and customs and it is like Audre Lorde says, like, it's not the differences that divide us, it's our inability to recognize and celebrate and name those differences. Like, the more that we just pretend that we're all the same, I think that actually plays into the whole regime thing even more. And I think the more that, like, for example, one process my friend Sophia Arman has taught me a lot about, and we worked on
Sorry,
the
sorry. I just laughed because I'm interviewing her next.
no way
Yeah,
I
yeah.
just,
I'm interviewing her next week on the legacy of the Armenian genocide. Yeah. So go ahead, go ahead.
we worked together on this well, she was just telling me some of her family stories, and we like sat down, and she, I typed and she wrote, and like she just was like it was an important collaboration where I was listening to her and also helping her, kind of like encouraging her to name these things, because I know in Syrian society we never talk about, I mean, in general there's a lot of, even in the sort of Islamist leaning parts of the revolution where they're very pro Erdogan, some of them, and some people in my own family, and it's really annoying. And even through our friendship, I learned so much about my own privilege of not knowing that, of not having to know that entire genocide in history that has shaped her entire reality. And I think it also goes to the diaspora piece too, because she was denied from her homeland, and you know her grandparents, the things that they went through, like, so the more that I'm able to listen to those experiences, even in Turkey when we were there, like I visited, I had no, I'd never been to like a Shia mosque before, or knew what like the Alawite like customs were, or met a person who was Assyrian who had different festivals, or even met a Kurdish person, like, and in the youth work especially that I would do with like different families, like there was this huge issue where all the refugees would come, and the refugee settlement people in the US are so orientalist. Ugh, I would interview them for different things, and they would be like, oh well, we thought that they were all going to be like the Iraqis were, and that they would all be Chaldean or something. And they would have no services for the Kurdish refugees because they assumed everyone was Arab, or they had no idea that there would be Christian Syrians. Like, and the same thing happened in the refugee camps in Greece, where people after the March 20 EU-Turkey deal, all Syrians were slated to be deported from Greece unless they could back to Turkey, unless they could prove that Turkey was unsafe. So a lot of minority people were in these court cases, and the lawyers they would tell me, like, I'm Armenian, I'm Kurdish, Turkey is not safe for me, I can't, this is different from like an Arab experience. And the lawyers would have no idea what they were talking about, and they would be like, can you find an academic source? Like, I don't know what they're saying is true. I mean, it's a whole other thing, how discourse is being used to like affirm or deny these realities. But like, people are living, like I was saying with the queer diasporas thing, in their very body are carrying the histories of these genocides. And we have to talk about it. We have to talk about, I mean, being, I'm like the white guy, kind of, like, I'm not really, but like the Arab Sunni Muslim, like that is the privilege. I think so much in diaspora too, like, because I'm a quote unquote minority in the US, or a lot of Arabs here, they'll think that, they won't acknowledge that actually back home we are the dominant ones. And it is really important to not invisibilize our differences and to just really take that seriously. And there's a reason why Basil Shahade was such a, like, or the Syrian Christians for Peace in the Revolution, or Siba Khadour in Alawites for the Revolution. Like, these movements were really, really important because they not only disrupted the regime's narrative, but they showed a specific kind of ethnic and religious experience that wasn't being centered or represented. And in our Syrians for Black Power video, actually, we really made sure to, not to say this in like a tokenizing way, but we really wanted to have Syrians from like every religious and sect group, especially when talking about racism. Like, we didn't just want a video of a bunch of Sunni Arab Muslims being like, we shouldn't be racist, because that's the whole point. We are constantly doing that to each other all the time.
Yeah, so I just also thought of, like, you mentioned how you're Sunni Arab in Syria, and I'm the Lebanese Maronite in Lebanon, and so there are these parallels there as well. But I would mention, like, even if, like, Fatwa Sulaiman's story, who obviously she passed away 4 years ago, if you go on the Wikipedia, I just remembered and I opened it just to kind of make that point. Like, it was a Syrian actress of Alawite descent who led a Sunni majority protest against Bashar al-Assad's government in Homs. She became one of the most recognized faces of the Syrian civil war. She's not one of the most recognized faces of the Syrian civil war because she didn't take part in the Syrian civil war in the first place. Like, that's one thing. And again, obviously, of Alawite descent who led the Sunni majority protest. And the difficulty for me as a, sorry, you were saying?
How do they even know that it was Sunni majority? Like, there's also an assumption.
Yes, of course. And so for me, the difficulty as let's just say as an activist trying to deal with all of that is that it just became painfully aware that these narratives are often like completely out of our control. Like, almost anything, or like right now, just I mentioned like Lebanese Maronite, whatever. If I start talking or I was interviewed on some show or whatever, and I mentioned that I oppose Hezbollah, like, it's almost inevitable that this is going to color how I'm perceived by certain people, right? And this is the difficulty of it, because sometimes I feel the need to mention it. I try not to, but sometimes I'm kind of put in a corner. And there was this American personality, I will mention his name because most people still don't know about this, Jimmy Dore, who's just whatever. He's not a nice person, but he accused me of being Al Qaeda on Twitter, like publicly, a couple of years ago, and it was in the same narratives as the white helmets are Al Qaeda. He's actually the person I mentioned before. Now I actually mentioned his name, and I don't remember. I don't think I mentioned it on Twitter because I don't want to use the Christian card for something like that, because then I'm basically saying, well, no, I'm not one of those guys, and that's not what I'm trying to say, obviously. But it's just so difficult to know when to navigate this and when not to navigate this, because on the one hand, I don't want the Christian cultural heritage that I have, I don't want that erased either. There is a specificity to Lebanese Christian history that is real. It's just there. people are right wing and left wing and whatnot, but there is this inherited heritage, and that's part of the Lebanese story. It's part of the Arab story. It's part of the region story, whatever. But at the same time, because now I'm obviously in Switzerland, I'm in Europe, then I'm in the minority, obviously. Then it's like, well, which category am I allowed to use, and how do I use it, and which one am I access? Which one do I have access to? All of these things. I don't want to just dump these things on you, but these are just one of the many ways that I started rethinking. Go back to that earlier point of multiplicities, right? I just have multiplicities in me. Like whether I want to or not, I go to Lebanon, I automatically inhabit a certain category that's just whether I want to or not is there. So my question is like, how do I dismantle it from within or from without? But then if I go to in Switzerland, where I currently live, being Lebanese Christian doesn't really matter that much, to be honest. And so it's just one of those many things that I just know that there are certain places where I will have advantages over Lebanese Muslims, for example. France being an obvious example, people who know the history of the Lebanese in France is a big one. In America, actually, Lebanese Americans, that's a big thing. In Latin America as well, Latin Americans of Lebanese and Syrian descent, a lot of them would be of Christian heritage, and that did play part of that diasporic history. That's a different topic. I will mention, just because you mentioned diaspora, that there is an excellent book by Akram Khater. I've met him in the US, and I may interview him soon. It's called Inventing Home: Emigration, Gender, and the Middle Class in Lebanon, 1870 to 1920. And he looks at that diaspora, including my part of my ancestry, that went to the Americas, and most importantly, that actually went back to Lebanon and what they brought with them. Because we know that the Lebanese Druze love to drink mate. Like, where does that come from? It comes from Latin America. But yeah, among other things, obviously they brought back ideas. One of the many things that they brought back with them, for example, is actually feminism. Something that a lot of Lebanese of the region where I grew up in, you had these pamphlets, feminist pamphlets in the 1910s and 1920s that would reference like actually quoting a feminist in America or feminist in Latin America or what have you, and just these underlying stories that goes back to this whole multiplicity, side of things.
Yeah, I feel like that also dismantles the whole idea of authenticity too, because we've already been migrating too. Like I think about even in my own family, our story has always been one of migration. My like mom's family, actually her mom is Algerian, and they came during an anti-colonial exodus that led by Abdul Qadir after he was exiled from Algiers, and then he lived in Damascus. And like our histories are already ones of migration, and so whenever people act like our diaspora is somehow less authentic, actually I was just talking to my friend about this because she was telling me when she was in Argentina, she had these like Arabic sweets, and she told me the name of it, and I was like, I don't think I've ever heard of that. And she was like, well, it must have been brought, with the Spaniards and the Moors and when they came. And so in a sense, diaspora also is like a time capsule. It's a form of time travel. Like I have said words from Ottoman, Syrian, Arabic. Like one time I was with my aunts and I was like, "Atini Qur'an, Andi Qur'an." And she was like, "What?" She just started laughing. She was like, Who says that?" She was like, "You just used a word that is from like 1920s Syria. Like no one says that anymore." And I was like, "Oh, I must have gotten it. Like my mom left in the 70s and her mom was using like kind of 1940s Arabic. She was probably using terms that like her mom was using." And I guess somehow in diaspora, because I like even word like when I would go back to Jordan, and the words that I would still use for like cell phone or whatever were like old and like not trendy anymore. Like it's this really interesting thing because you carry these migrations and these stories inside of you. Like my dad's side of the family are actually actual Bedu who came in the early 20th century, late 19th century to Syria. And that's actually even a different class from other Fallah who are non-Bedu but indigenous. But the Bedu would always be, like even more quote unquote barbaric or like pre-modern or whatever. So we even have those kinds of traditions in us. Like I would always grow up doing hinne, for example, at weddings, and then my Damascene side would be like, oh, Syrians don't do that. We don't know where you got that from. And I would be like, I'm pretty sure this is carried from the Gulf, but like through Syria. Like it's so beautiful. I don't know. I wish we all had more space to really just practice our cultural lineage. Like I don't know, the migrations that we carry in our actual bodies. Like none of this is new, basically. You know, we've been doing this for a long time, migrating and like having new cultural identities and experiences because of political processes.
Yeah, I really think like just on that note that there's just a lot to learn from the experiences of diaspora, and I will link it. I think the episode that comes before this one, I'm not exactly sure, but it's with Promise Lee, and he's a Hong Kong activist in exile in the US. And I've had a number of these conversations on Hong Kong. I think that was the third one or the fourth one. I had one on Taiwan, or the Taiwan one wasn't diaspora related. But the Hong Kong ones were all now, a lot of them are recently exiled. A lot of them are like really in the past year and a half, and they have to sort of navigate this entire thing because a significant percentage of the population is leaving due to the crackdown by the CCP. And those are going to become inevitable questions to be asked, and of course no one's going to find one answer, one satisfying answer anyway, but it's definitely something worth having. um, I wanted to ask you like a final thing before the book section, which is like you had this video that you released like 10 years ago. I have it in front of me, called Syrians Are United. And I just wanted, if that's okay, like I will link it. I will link all of this anyway. But if that's okay, if you can sort of describe it and also describe the flag behind, because I find that very interesting. And yeah, after that we'll just go straight to the book section.
Yeah, that's so funny that you watched that because the very first one I did is the one that went viral and that made me wanted for 50 million lira. So my mom encouraged me to make more, you know, and that was one of them. And that was because there was this narrative that that Syrians were you know, that it was a Sunni revolution,
Mm-hmm.
symbolizing the activism of so many Assyrians and like Armenians and Druze people and Kurdish people, especially when you look at the roots of the revolution in the Kurdish uprisings in 2004, and like that they were challenging Arab nationalism and Baath ideology like since its onset. So I don't quite remember, but I think that I'm sitting in front of a flag which my mom actually made with different symbols of ethnic groups.
Yeah, yeah, pretty
I have
much.
I have the sword. I have the Alawite sword. I have the sun, the Kurdish sun. I have probably
I think
maybe
it's the Syrian star, if I'm not
yeah,
mistaken.
the star. Um, yeah, and it was just to reflect. I mean, a lot of my early experiences meeting other activists, they were Kurdish, they were Assyrian, they taught me so much. Just the revolution itself taught me and introduced me to so many different kinds of Syria. I have this poem that I wrote about it where, like, you know, in the camps I met like friends, people who I'm still in contact with, like who were also farm working backgrounds, but they would send me the way that they make kebse, you know, and it would be completely different. Or I met these two sisters from Banyas who I like just love so much, and they're like my sisters. I had never met people from Banyas before, or even people from Latiye, and I met like chain smoking Kurdish philosophers and like Assyrian punk feminists who had a freaking pot of hashish in their balcony in Turkey, you know, and like just I had never grown up with a Syria where any of that was possible. I grew up with a conservative idea of Syria that to be a real Syrian, you are a conservative Sunni person who like follows the rules and doesn't speak up. So all of these different things like transformed my experience of Syria for me and taught me about the beauty, and it's not to like say that in a cliche way or whatever, but even like the film collective Abu Nadara, they have this interview they did. Maybe I can send you the link.
Yeah, I've definitely watched it. I'm obsessed with them.
Yeah, like the famous, they say that part of their art form reflects earlier Syrian anti-sectarian creativity, and they pointed out, which I never knew this, that the famous Syrian mosaic boxes, you know, with the pearl inlay, the wooden style of that, it actually came in the 1880s from this Syrian Christian named Jerzy Bitar, who was trying to show the French colonizers that Syrians were united, and that they would not be divided across religious and sect lines and pit against each other. So he created this art form, this special box using the Islamic architectural geometries with the sort of Byzantine Christian elements as well. And he brought together like the Muslim and the Christian to have a physical kind of mosaic that he could show them, and that Syrians could feel proud of, that our culture is like a mosaic, that we're not all the same. And that's what makes us so powerful, is that we have this this overlapping diversity.
Awesome. Well, on that amazing note, would you mind sharing with us like your book recommendations?
Oh yeah, so the ones that I picked were Syria Speaks: Art and Culture on the Frontline, edited by three people: Nawara Mahfouz, Zahir Umarin, and Malu Halasa. I don't know how to say their name, but I also picked Zatar Diva by Suhair Hamad, one of my favorite Palestinian American poets, and she was writing it after 9/11, and I think she has such a strong, going back to this whole like voice of diaspora and what that looks like. Like she has a poem that's like, I have never been to Ramallah, but I know the man like carrying the falafel, and I know the little boy running in the street, and I remember this. Like, I don't know, it's so beautiful, and I love her voice because she's a soft kind of feminized poet. She doesn't do this whole like dominance kind of thing, like emotionally. She's very like soft spoken. I love that. And then the last one that I picked was Homegirls and Hand Grenades by Sonia Sanchez, because it's a Black arts movement poetry book. I think I have it. I have it somewhere over here, but I love it because it experiments with language, like so many, you know, Arab modernist poets would later kind of do, but just this whole idea of becoming not legible, like no longer speaking to be heard, but actually speaking in code or speaking in tongues or creating our own forms of English. And I love Sonia Sanchez so much. So yes, I was wondering if I could finish with my poem that I
Yes, I was gonna ask actually about it. Please go ahead.
um so I mentioned my friend Hala before, but
Yes.
during the first summer of the revolution, she brought together all of the children of the opposition activists, and she had them write down their dreams for a future Syria, which everyone thought was dumb and stupid, and all the like young teenage guys were like, this is so stupid. But now I look back at that, and all of us are adults now, and we're, you know, from all over. Like these kids were coming from inside Syria, from France, from Turkey. And I couldn't think of any line to say. So the line that she gave me was, في سوريا المستقبل لن يكون رأي همسا. And in future Syria, my voice will not be a whisper. So I wrote this poem, imagining what freedom, like, because Syrians are curating freedom and embodying freedom, just like moving away from intellectualizing it and being kind of fun and thinking about pleasure as a form of freedom. So في سوريا المستقبل لن يكون رأي همسا. In a future Syria, my voice will not be a whisper. You wrote this line for me, sister. Then they came for you and slit your throat on a Friday afternoon when the sun was out. You kept speaking. You grabbed my hand and said, listen. I felt your voice vibrating from my tongue. I felt your soft whisper in the morning light, and you told me, speak up. What was that movement in the night? Where did we leave off? I heard a chorus of yellow birds singing, one day, one day, one day we'll return. To the sea, to Syria, ya Sirena, one day we will come. In a future Syria, we will be sister dancing, brown-eyed, brown-skinned, full of heaven on our tongues. In a future Syria, Hamza wa Hajar's dreams will burst forth from the sun. In a future Syria, we will greet each other with ouds and ancient lutes. In a future Syria, we will begin the day from the soil of our grandmother's roots. We will remember what we wrote on the fig leaves, the secrets we kept until we'd return. We will remember what we wrote on the leaflets our sisters threw from the university buildings and were tortured for. We will burn down the NGOs and make freedom schools out of paper plates, plant damask rose on the path, fill the streets with jacaranda trees, and throw lavender tissue paper out the windows in the breeze. And who could forget the jasmines? Our constitution will be written from jasmines and coffee grinds, hung on every rooftop clothesline, imprinted on our mirrors and music and calligraphy letters. We will not forget the children, and the top priority on the political agenda will be their laughter. Our right to return and reconciliation process will be implemented through 12-point drum circle plans and secured by Arabic chewing gum. Each person will be guaranteed silt of the Euphrates, pebbles from the Berada, and an all-access path to the cemeteries to see our loved ones. The temple of Jupiter will be re-sanctified and every explosion reversed. Every dead person will rise up from the soil once we water it a little bit. They will dance with us, making olive trees our only shelters from the storms.
Amazing. Thank you for sharing that. Well, on that note, it's just an amazing note to end on. Banah, thanks a lot for your time.
Thanks so much. This was great. I can't wait to hear it.
Fire These Times is made possible by supporters on Patreon. If you'd like to support through a monthly donation, you can head out to patreon.com/firethesetimes. And if you want to explore other options, you can do so by checking out the website.